Welcome to part 4 of the Unobstructed Way, Escaping the Vortex. Now we begin our deep dive into the details of life here and hereafter, the meaning of it all, and practices that can improve anyone's well-being by opening a level of communication with spirits, but most importantly, with our own soul. We are told that all spiritual paths begin best with skepticism. Stewart shares 2 reliable tests for any mystical adventure. First, he warns us away from any path, spiritual or business, that is urgent, quote, specially chosen, unquote, or, quote, a great revelation that is yours to give the world, unquote. In such cases, Stewart assures us, quote, you may be pretty certain that you are on the sucker list, unquote. Of course, there are rare exceptions. After all, Stewart himself was involved in what could be described as a great revelation that was his to give the world, his and Betty's. The other test is, quote, simple and reliable, unquote, because it is our own state of mind. If our spiritual path causes us to feel anxious, exhausted, or depressed, we are on the wrong track. But Stewart warns us that, quote, exaltation, elation, and extravagance, unquote, are no better. What we're after is what he calls, quote, a peaceful, carefree, normal time, unquote. Not that this is easy to accomplish in a world where so many exist in the vortex, almost everyone. The dictionary defines vortex as a, quote, whirling mass of fluid, unquote. The Invisibles used vortex to describe something else, a state of being that can whip us away like a tornado or pull us under like a riptide. So what exactly is the vortex? In a letter to an inner circle of friends written just after Betty's death, Stewart described bumping into an acquaintance on the street in Santa Barbara. The man hoped Stewart would be heartbroken by the loss of his wife and the failure of their belief system. He was so amazed by Stewart's certainty and by the story he had to tell, he ran home to reread the Betty book. But what kind of person gets a sense of satisfaction from the suffering of his friend? What kind of human being would want to see faith crushed and love extinguished? The vortex is more than a place of forgetfulness. Most of the life we see around us every day is a desperate struggle. The bug scurries in fear of the bird. The bird glances nervously for fear of the cat. Known and unknown insects, parasites, viruses, bacteria, poisons, man-made and natural, lurk everywhere to colonize the weak. America came close to losing Abraham Lincoln when his family cow wandered into a patch of weeds that turned out to be healthful for bovines, but in milk, deadly poison to humans. We mortal creatures with our cosmic minds have already foreseen the sun's demise and that of our home world. Keep moving. That sign is everywhere in our universe, and it is strictly enforced. It's interesting to note that in the popular Abraham Hicks teachings, the word vortex is used to describe a place or state of creativity that organizes the manifestations of the law of attraction. Esther Hicks, one of the founders of the movement, wrote a book in 2009 called The Vortex, where the law of attraction assembles all cooperative relationships. Obviously, the same word is used to describe different experiences. For a better understanding of the vortex as defined by the Invisibles, let's consider 2 of the most feared experiences of human life. First, people who make life difficult, emotional vampires, dehumanizing bureaucracies, self-promoting betrayers, sadists of cold profit, and psychopaths of malicious glee. We find them in our offices, in authority, even in our friendships, loves, and families. Second, consider the disasters that seem to randomly ruin the lives of the innocent. About the first, Betty said, quote, "Unfortunately, many of our daily contacts must be with dragging, non-receptive, aggravating, non-comprehending, and uncongenial personalities. Ordinarily, perhaps in such cases, we are inclined to take refuge in indifference that amounts to a separating gulf. It's not if not indifferent, then we are contemptuous of them, or actively in conflict with them, or even if we are of nervous, sensitive temperaments, they drive us crazy. And usually we are ourselves more or less affected, more or less nagged into deteriorating emotions. Daily contact with such people is one of the first things we must learn to manage," unquote. When confronted with people who, quote, "obstruct our streams," unquote, we can develop, quote, "superior vitality," unquote, and overflow the obstacle. Sensitive people, Betty admitted, may be repulsed by such confrontations. The impasse seems hopeless. The Invisibles advised us not to criticize such people. Like a physician, we can occupy ourselves with avoiding contamination and focusing on healing. Quote, "Confront with your own harmony the problem of disharmony," unquote. Stewart had some advice of his own to offer. Quote, "The antidote is sympathy. Unfortunately, sympathy is one of those mildewed words, or at least it has spots of mildew. Nothing is more annoying to the average of humanity than the false sort of sympathy, even when it is wholly sincere. The sort of sympathy that is sentimentally maudlin, or talks too much, or ostentatiously Christian. And no better is the kind that tries to, quote, "share your trials and sorrows," unquote, that so completely enters your annoyance or perplexity or grief as to adopt it, to strengthen it, and perhaps to end by leaning against you for comfort," unquote. When dealing with people who drag us down, we can understand that the man or woman we struggle with is not a personal nemesis, just a soul at a certain level of evolution. We've been where they are, making a pain in the ass of ourselves. They'll be where we are, cringing at the lack of civility and common sense. In response, we must not sermonize or scold, just become the best example of a well-lived life we can. Stewart explains the nature of this practice in more detail. Quote, "The first step in control, then, is the possession of such an inner fortress for protection and refreshment. The nature of it can be described in many ways, but the main thing to acquaint yourself with is a feeling of liberation and immersion in complete security and power and warmth and beauty of happiness. Continually practice on this ideal nucleus, enlarging it, enriching it, intensifying its atmosphere with your accumulated memories of harmonious moments of life," unquote. What about the accidents that wreck so many lives? Perhaps the victim arrived at the wrong place at the wrong time. What are these intrusions of chaos or evil that cause so many to live in fear and sorrow? The Invisibles called them, quote, "runaway trains," unquote, and, quote, "derelicts," unquote, defined not as vagrants, but as neglected duties. When we don't live up to our individual missions in life, things that only we could have accomplished go unfinished. If we duck our responsibilities, the consequences are not ours alone. The apparently innocent suffer too. Apparently is the appropriate word because the Invisibles insist there are no accidents. When asked about those who die too young, they use the metaphor of pruning. The life and identity remain, to grow again in a new way. The old way would have had difficult consequences, unforeseen results that were better left unexplored. Quote, but just as rank growth is pruned, so is weak growth, unquote. A fresh start provides a better opportunity and preserves the harmony of the great ongoing experiment. Betty asked the question that has broken so many hearts. Why has someone we love been taken so young? Betty explained that, quote, the fragment of existence we spend on earth, unquote, is only a fraction of continuous life when seen in its entirety. A soul may get, quote, certain small things, unquote, from the earth phase of its existence. Development continues in the unobstructed, free of the necessary resistance that made it possible to get those certain small things. The timing and the meaning of the ending of sojourns in the obstructed, currently beyond human comprehension. It appears to be one of the rules of the game, at least for the time being. As we shall see later, the Invisibles answered questions about the meaning of life with the concepts greater quantity and quality of consciousness. Betty wonders if perhaps those who die young have collected a sufficient quantity for their purposes, while those who stay behind are still collecting. What if we would rather avoid getting pruned? How can we dodge those runaway trains? Quote, if you accumulate enough harmonious force, there is an automatic action. Your own impetus is strong enough to fend you off. It can be. There is something you can generate that both quickens your senses and subconsciously directs you, unquote. That word Betty used, impetus, has some interesting definitions. A driving force, impulse, incentive, stimulus, the property possessed by a moving body in virtue of its mass and its motion. We've all heard stories about people who decided to follow an inexplicable feeling and so didn't board a doomed flight, or who called in sick the day disaster struck at work. The Invisibles talked about spiritual hygiene and decent living. Just as a daily shower keeps away vermin and disease, so daily spiritual practice can prevent unnecessary suffering. We can lift our altitude and avoid a host of troubles. The gravity of the mundane is a vortex. If we want to stay above it, we have to stay alert. The Invisibles gave two techniques for resisting the vortex. The first is passive. When confronted with the vortex, relax away from it. Observe it from the safe distance of your innermost self. Take a bird's eye view. Refreshed by this retreat, you'll return to the challenge knowing what to do, or at least you'll be more capable of perceiving clearly what is most important in the situation. As the Invisibles put it, quote, when things go wrong, abandon all contemplation of your problem in detail and recall your activities to the center of your being, unquote. The other technique for getting out and staying out of the vortex is more than just a strong sense of self. Call it spiritual confidence, enlightenment, or perhaps Zen. The Invisibles coined the word foredetermination to describe the right attitude. Betty called it, quote, spiritual sure-footedness, unquote. The Invisibles explained, watch your four determinations. Bad days must not be bad before they begin. Put your consciousness on the shelf, the level above, before you start out every day. You need more preparedness for yourself, unquote. Elsewhere, Betty said, bring your own world into the room, like a child playing. Don't meet the vortex on its own ground. Make it meet you on yours, unquote. So how do we learn to take the bird's eye view? How do we find a center and learn to be positive? For example, can the hypochondriac who thinks he's got every sickness he hears about learn how to bring steady health into his own and other people's lives? The answer, according to the Invisibles, is what they called spiritual contact. Spiritual contact gives us spiritual vitality, which allows us to overflow obstacles and avoid runaway trains. Quote, even if we practice spiritual contact only once in a while, unquote, Stewart commented, quote, it can become a wonderful experience, one that will bring a unique peace and understanding. And in the crises of life, it can give support and illumination unimaginable, unquote. Does spiritual contact mean contact each with our own spirit or with other spirits? Obviously both, but contact with our own is most important. Some mystics have believed souls can only be earned. Betty is encouraging us to remember that we are souls. So, how do we get spiritual contact? Relaxed appreciation is where it all begins. The Invisibles explain that we, quote, unconsciously absorb, unquote, the atmospheres we surround ourselves with. By living in a, quote, spiritually harmonious atmosphere, unquote, we are strengthened by it and given wider horizons than we had imagined. Quote, choose the companionship of inspiration, unquote, advised the Invisibles. Quote, outside your hours of duty, refresh and stimulate your thought chambers by constantly associating yourself with the aristocracy of the spirit wherever you can recognize it, unquote. The Invisibles taught that appreciation is a great force in the universe, quote, a radiance of the power of love, unquote. For every tragic event in the news each day, and all those that are never reported, there are uncounted acts of kindness that combine like instruments in a vast orchestra to lift up our lives. Appreciation opens the senses, focuses awareness on the present moment, inspires feelings of joy. The Invisibles ask us to keep in mind that we are doing this opening up, this deliberate relaxation and appreciation with the intent, the eager desire of knowledge of our spiritual faculties and dimensions. With our thoughts and bodies quiet, as we enjoy a panoramic view or a delicate flower, we are ready to receive. That doesn't mean becoming a medium or hearing the voice of a dead relative. It means nourishing our soulful qualities, enriching our emotions, drawing upon inspiration. Quote, take it on faith for a moment, unquote, Stewart asked of his readers, quote, that from the world of the spiritual that is part of us and should be a balanced part of us, comes an instant, almost automatic response to any genuine contact, unquote. Stewart admitted relaxation isn't as easy as it sounds. Quote, exercises like telling every muscle to relax only put more attention on the body. Trying to control your thoughts is vigilance, and vigilance isn't relaxing. The implication of all these methods seems to be an excluding of the world by some sort of drastic focusing of the mind, unquote. Stewart shared his own effective techniques in beautiful prose. Quote, I evolved and grew into a little daily routine. I would begin by lying flat on my back, preferably on the floor because of its more stable support. Then for a brief space, I would picture to myself various relaxing things. A dog flopped asleep in the sunshine, a cat stretched out before the fire, a coat on a coat hanger, the sensation of floating in warm water, or of falling comfortably through space. For example, I would repeatedly divert my attention to little discontinuous noises, a bird singing, the creaking of the woodwork, the wind passing in the trees, unquote. When thought stops, pure awareness shines in the present moment. Stewart continues, quote, it had occurred to me that when one looks or listens or feels with his whole mind, he does not think. Sometimes I would use memory pictures as the substitute. A tiny brook murmuring contentedly among the giant sugar pines. A green meadow in the enchanted silence of the forest depths. Thin rose clouds streaking a sunset sky, the shimmer of moonlight upon the summer sea. These and their kind I would pursue until the thrill and the wonder of beauty had closed gentle fingers about my consciousness, unquote. Later, Stewart described a similar technique he often used. Quote, I would very carefully picture myself as floating unanchored in space. Various physical symbols helped. A bird high above the ground. An airplane in space, touching nothing. A balloon in the stratosphere. One picture that seemed to be particularly effective was that of smoke rising slowly and hanging under the ceiling. As long as my interest was centered in these, no bustling thoughts came to disturb me. Last of all, I would very carefully detach myself from my symbols and try to sense myself as a disembodied point of consciousness in space. Surprisingly, this wasn't too hard to do, though at first the effect stayed with me for only an instant, unquote. Stewart reports his attainment of consciousness outside form with such nonchalance, the same way he described his adventures in the wilderness. He reminds us that getting serious in this practice can defeat the purpose. Quote, the secret of success with the reinforcing power of the higher consciousness is to practice with it as a recreation. Then, when the time comes, you can test its reality by deliberately selecting an upsetting moment, a harassed moment, and applying it purposefully. But before you can use it in serious matters, you must first use it for your own pleasure. Otherwise, it won't hold up, unquote. Always the considerate scout and guide, Stewart warned us that these moments of exaltation can delude us with false optimism. Quote, this insight or revelation is, in its full clarity, rarely more than a flash or a glimpse. For one fleeting instant, we seem to feel that we know what it's all about. The moment passes, but the accompanying exaltation lingers. We begin to think it is permanent. We mistake the mood for a permanent state of being. From now on, we are going through life a tiptoe and a tingle in vibrant exuberance. The load is lifted, the struggle banished. The more confident of that we are, the more disconcerting, even dangerous, is going to be the reaction. For inevitably and inexorably we shall come down from tiptoe. Our ecstasy is going to drain back to its earned level, unquote. Stewart emphasizes the need for balancing the spiritual and the physical in our lives. Quote, I was soon made to see that this getting aside from the body was intended only as a temporary freeing from its demands, in order that I might act untrammeled in another part of myself, and also as a byproduct that I might actually experience by sensation that the body is only an attribute of the spirit, like the mind, as are the hands to the body itself. The process is nothing desirable in itself. The body is no stepchild. In final analysis, it is full partner, and neglect of it or ignoring of it may be as disastrous to the whole entity as subservience to it. A new way to pray. The Invisibles asked us to dismiss our common ideas about prayer. Please discard from your mind all stilted, conventional meaning it may have for you now. It has become largely, and to many, a childhood ceremony almost abandoned as life engulfs us. To others, an unconvincing act, a petition for favors from an overlord, a ritual, a paean of personal praise. Forget all that, unquote. Once again, appreciation is key. Quote, start over again without preconception. Next, as the first contribution to its meaning, assemble under it all that you've come to understand as the process of seeking spiritual contact and permeation. This process constitutes the first step in all constructive prayer, unquote. To pray is to seek wholeness. Prayer uncovers what we lack, helping us to naturally attract what we need to harmonize with life. Prayer plumbs our depths and reaches to our heights. Prayer is spiritual companionship. But to whom should we address our prayers? Quote, to consciousness, unquote, replied Betty. In 2 words, reducing most religion to idolatry. However we visualize deity, isn't what we're really after a greater consciousness, a consciousness that sees what we can't see, that does what we can't do, wiser, more loving, more beautiful, good, and true? Quote, you pray for us, we pray for you, unquote, the Invisibles said. Quote, you can be, in a sense, our guardian angels as we are yours, unquote. This is similar to the Tibetan Powa meditation, which is said to benefit the living, the dead, and even the departed who have incarnated in their next lives on earth or some other dimension of material existence. What is the purpose and best practice of prayer? How should we pray? Betty's answer to this question was, quote, as though I were drowning in a great sea, and there was a ship full of people, any or all of whom could help me, unquote. Betty gave us this gorgeous description of prayer. It's a beautiful form, a grand rhythm. In utter obliviousness of everything else, I fling myself, abandon myself to one collective thought, the beauty of a physical world. I sweep it whole right into my heart, everything, the little alpine flowers on Kearsarge, the undersea gardens, the desert bloom, the frost crystals, the world of the magnifying glass, the stars, all the physical universe, the manifestation of overpowering love and intelligence. I gather them all in my own great rush of worship, unquote. Appreciation is not only a great power of good in the obstructed, it also helps us to open our minds and hearts. All that we cherish here is ultimately temporary. We all travel together through space and time. As Plotinus said, quote, everything breathes together, unquote. We can ignore the familiar, or we can realize how much it means to us. And looking back at our childhoods, at people, pets, places, even toys long gone, we realize what it would mean to us to see them again. With that awareness, we can better appreciate our present lives. Betty describes how this appreciation of living can heal us. Quote, it's an offering, the concentration of my life's experience returning to its source. Once spent, I lie still and quietly, life recharged filters back to me, recharged with vitality, strength, and eagerness to take my part, to be victorious with humility, conscious of the immensity of the scheme. When the renewed life flows back into me, my great effort is to retain it, to contain it all, in all, for the force of the renewed life must be converted into world activity. Unquote. In his final book, With Folded Wings, Stewart explained the subtle difference between meditation and prayer. Quote, meditation might be defined as a consciously entered state of attunement with the source of all being, a conscious, purposeful offering of ourselves as a channel for the flow through from the source. And finally, a conscious directing or intentioning of the flow towards some desirable purpose. Its nature is essentially active, autonomous, unquote. Appreciation of life and of nature opens the senses, the mind, and the heart to something greater than our daily predicaments. We can tune into the source of all that wonder and beauty. How does this differ from prayer? Stewart continued. Quote, prayer as a state of consciousness is also an attunement, but rather in the purpose of communion with or submission to a higher power than of overt activity. Its action is more passive and receptive. Except for these slight distinctions, the terms meditation and prayer can be considered for practical purposes as nearly enough synonymous. In other words, both meditation and prayer are ways to develop spiritual contact and therefore spiritual sure-footedness. That is the end of part 4, and we hope that you found it inspiring. We will next be looking at part 5, which will be called Spiritual Sure-Footedness, appropriately enough. And that section will also give us some insights into the freedom to heal, and I think you will find it most helpful. Thank you so much for tuning in, and if you enjoyed it, please subscribe, and please consider leaving us a thumbs up and or a comment so that we know that you would like to have more of these. See you next time.